Alright, you can see that I've got the motor on and also that I've taken these two things off. But the first thing I actually did was I went through and I made sure all the screws throughout the entire helicopter were all nice and tight. After I did that, then I went ahead and took my swash plate guide off, as well as this little front plate that sits up here. And then when I had that plate off, I decided to mount my motor first, because that way I had the most access to it up front before, without the servo and without the plate there. So in the same bag that you get your motor pinion and stuff and your blade grip bolts, you also get the bolts for your main motor. So when you put the bolts on, though, make sure you use some blue thread locker, so that way the bolts don't work themselves out. But go ahead and get your motor mounted up, and I've got a different pinion on there. That's why you don't see this pinion on there. But again, that's because the shaft on my motor is a 5mm shaft. The pinion that comes with the kit is only meant for a 4mm shaft. So, but anyways, I got that mounted on there, and then moved on to the servos. Okay, the servos. Now, you can see I've got a lot more stuff on here. I've got my gyro mounted, I've got my ESC mounted, my BEC. Back here, I've got the tail servo mounted, and I've got it mounted to the back of the clamps back here. The aileron and pitch servos are mounted like this. Mount the servo horn closer that way. And the elevator servo is mounted like this, and you're going to mount it to the far frame wall. So anyways, when it comes to mounting the servos, one of the problems I had was the included hardware to mount the servos. The screws were too big to use, because most standard size servos, because again, the little spacers that they give you for the kit don't fit the size servos that you would normally use for a 500 size kit. And so that means you got to use standard size servos, but with the standard size servos, usually you have a rubber bushing on the edge with a metal insert. Well, the problem being, let's pan down here. So the included hardware, whoops, there goes one screw. The screws are too fat to fit through most brass fittings, or whatever little fittings you got there. So you can't get the screws through it. But then the other problem is they only give you 4 long ones, but you need 12. So they give you 4 long ones and then 8 short ones. Well, so they're all too fat, and then the 8 short ones really need to be long ones to work for standard size servos. And then the other problem is these spacers that they come with. For standard size servos, these spacers are too short. So that left me with a big problem with trying to mount my servos. Now, lucky for me, I had an extra servo mounting kit from the eSmart, the ES600, and that servo mounting kit worked great. You get 12 long screws that are thin enough to go through the metal fittings, and the spacers are just that much bigger, just enough to give you proper clearance to mount standard size servos. So that is what I did to have to mount my servos. But back to mounting them. Okay, so all I'm doing is I'm starting the screw through my servo, putting it through the spacer. I always start with the top one, because then it can swing down and I can usually get the bottom one in once I get the top screw started. Put it through, and then I usually just hold on to the end of it, pair of needle nose, and it can be tricky sometimes. It's where it's really handy to have a third pair of hands. But once I get started like that, again, I can swing that down the back part and then line up the bottom one. But I'll do the same thing for this back one, get it started, and then put the bottom screws in, tighten them all up, and keep going. Okay, I've got my servos mounted, and I've already gone through and ran all my wires. I've got my aileron, my pitch servos here. I've got my wires. They come down through the back here, through the frame, and then they meet up with this piece of wire loom. And the wire loom I used, it's just plastic wire loom. You can get it at most auto parts stores, hardware stores. It's cheap, easy to use, and does a great job of protecting your wires, because it's got a metal frame, so you always want to be careful of anywhere that the wires come through the frame or anything that you don't want them get them rubbing, so where they wear through the protective rubber coating on the wires. So anyways, I've got my wires all secured. I've got my ESC mounted, my BEC. You can see I've got my battery up here. So anyways, you can see here I've still got the linkages up in the air, because I still got to go through and put my servo horns on there. Okay, you can see my two servo horns here. Now this is the one I'm going to use for my elevator servo, and this one I'm going to be using for my aileron servo, but I've got the exact same thing on my pitch servo too. But what I wanted to show you was, you can see here the servo horn, how the ball links there mount from the top down. Well, on the aileron and pitch servo, they're going to mount from the back side. And one thing to help when you're screwing the ball links on, make sure, just put the servo horn flat down and then press down with an Allen screwdriver as you're screwing the ball link in. One thing, you may choose to drill out the hole a little bit to make screwing that in a little bit easier. But if you do that, you really want to make sure you can find yourself some little nuts to screw on the back side here. You can see. You really want to use those anyway, so try to find some. If you can get your hands on the hardware kit from the ES600 there, the eSmart, you can find those in that kit. So that was just what I wanted to show you about the servo horns. Alright, you can see I've got pretty much everything all installed. I got a little setup left to do in the head, but that's about it. Now, I didn't go through my whole setup with, get my servos to operate in the right direction. But if you need help with that, just watch my series on the ES600, the eSmart. That'll tell you all about how I go through and set up my servos, to get everything working right. But with everything mounted where I wanted it, got my ESC, got my BEC down here, obviously the battery. I've got my gyro, my servos back here. I've got the wires all run nice and neat. Okay, now this side's got a lot less wires on it, but got my receiver up here, got my little satellite antenna over here. See the wire for my elevator servo. Now you can see this metal bell crank right here. This is an elevator bell crank from the eSmart. They fit on here great. It's perfect size. So if you want to get yourself some, those will work great. You can see I've got my battery down here on the battery tray. In case you're wondering, this rubber band, what this is because I've got so many batteries that I forget which ones are charged, which ones aren't charged. So what I started doing is, when I charge my batteries, I put a rubber band on it. When I'm done flying, I take the rubber band off. That way I know that I've already discharged the battery and it needs to be recharged. Just a little easy way to help myself remember. So again, now I need to go through and do a little bit more setup on the head. Get all my, get this all set up, get my pitch set up. And then I'm going to go out and take it for a test hover, and then hopefully for a test flight. Okay guys, there it is, the ES500. And you can see it next to its bigger brother, the ES600. So, I didn't bother to bore you with all the test hovers, which was just taking off, trying to get everything trimmed out. I think I got it pretty good. It still needs some work. Definitely needs a new set of blades. Those things track horribly. But it's a little windy out here, so I'm going to go for a quick test flight. And because I forgot to mention this earlier, the battery that I'm using in it is a $34 5-cell 3000 mAh lithium polymer battery from Hobby City. So $34 bucks. Okay, I'm going to go take this up real quick.